You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 410, recorded on Sunday, January 30th, 2022. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line from Idaho, as always, is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
This week we're talking about opiates in the 19th century United States during and after the American Civil War, a subject that remains in debate but lays the earliest groundwork for many of the drug policies and views adopted in the 20th century and more recently. So before we get to the Civil War period, we need to go back in time a little bit and set this up with some context about what the available technologies were, equipment, medicine, etc. So, Rachel, could you get us started off on, we're obviously not going to go all the way back to the beginning of the history of opium in the misty past, but in terms of the 19th century and the sort of invention and synthesis process for, making not exactly modern medicines, but something close to that. Where do we need to start on that?
So let's start with morphine, kind of the first modern iteration of an opiate that was used for medicinal purposes. So morphine was discovered as the first active alkaloid extracted from the opium poppy plant in December 1804 in Paderborn by German pharmacist Friedrich Surturner. In 1817, Surturner reported experiments in which he administered morphine to himself, 3 young boys, 3 dogs, and a mouse. All 4 people almost died. Surturner originally named the substance morphium after the Greek god of dreams, Morpheus, as it has a tendency to cause sleep. Surturner's morphium was 6 times stronger than opium. He hypothesized that, because lower doses of the drug were needed, it would be less addictive. However, Surturner became addicted to the drug, warning that, quote, "I consider it my duty to attract attention to the terrible effects of this new substance I called morphium, in order that calamity may be averted," end quote. And as a note, heroin, a synthesized industrial version of morphine, was invented but never utilized in 1874, and then was reinvented by researchers working for Bayer in the late 1890s. Bayer mass-produced and marketed heroin, but morphine and laudanum would have been the commercially available opiates in the first several decades of the Second Industrial Revolution period. And the idea of injected medicine as a modern medical concept didn't really start gaining ground until the 1840s, but it also required a mass-produced delivery system for it to take off. Hypodermic glass syringes were invented in 1851 in Scotland and popularized around 1858. And for some broader context about the opium poppy, there are a great many known varieties and subspecies of the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, L. papaveraceae. History shows that it is one of the world's oldest cultivated plants. This is also obvious from the fact that the plant is no longer found in a wild state. Most of the world's utility plants are more or less confined to a definite climate and within relatively narrow geographical limits. However, this is not the case with the opium poppy, which can be successfully grown in relatively large areas of the world with a high yield of opium alkaloids. It does not require any particular type of soil and reacts well to fertilizers. This is one of the main advantages in terms of agronomics, national economy, and the available supply. Interestingly, there was never much U.S. poppy production for either medicinal or recreational uses, or just poppy seeds for baking, and it has instead historically been legally imported for permissible uses from places like Europe or India, or briefly the American-occupied Philippines after the Spanish War in 1898. But the occupations of Poland and the Netherlands in World War II rocketed the price so high that California farmers tried to rush into the breach and planted poppies in huge volumes, but Congress stepped in pretty much immediately and banned it by the end of 1942. Going back to the late 19th century, which is our area of focus today, San Francisco Police Chief Jesse B. Cook, recalling pre-earthquake era Chinatown opium activity policing after the 1875 local ban on public consumption, quote, "The opium den was another thing that the Chinese resorted to because they had no other place to go. At that time, nearly every store in Chinatown had an opium layout in the rear for their customers. All a Chinaman had to do was bring his opium. In those days, the Chinese were allowed to smoke opium, provided they did not do so in the presence of a white man. If a white man was present, it meant the arrest of all who were in the room at the time," end quote. And we kind of want to drill down on morphine usage, kind of starting with the Civil War era. So Bill, if you want to take that over.
Yes, so earlier Rachel talked about the development of hypodermic needles and glass syringes in the 1840s and 1850s. And again, it didn't get popularized until the very end of the 1850s. So that meant that it missed a lot of the other wars that were going on during that period. Unlike chloroform, for example, these new technologies didn't get much use in the various European wars of the 1850s. This means that the American Civil War would be their first wide-scale military trial for use with painkillers, such as morphine, to the extent that needles and syringes were available. When they were unavailable, other delivery methods were used. And unfortunately, as we'll talk about, this may have left a significant number of veterans addicted to morphine after the war. So let's talk a little bit more about the usage of this morphine, syringes, and so forth during this period in the run-up to and then during the Civil War. So reading now from a summer 2002 article in the American Journal of Pharmaceutical Education titled Opium and Its Alkaloids, morphine became generally used as an analgesic in the 1830s, but its use for rapid analgesia did not occur until the perfection of the hypodermic needle in 1853. The alkaloid was used extensively during the American Civil War, but since hypodermic needles were not readily available in those years, opium tincture and opium pills were far more commonly encountered. Morphine was commonly placed directly on the flesh wounds, and as we'll talk about, that usually means sprinkling it as a dust. The Union Army used 2.8 million ounces of opium tincture and powder and about 500,000 opium pills. At the termination of the Civil War, many wounded veterans had become addicted to morphine, and their continued dependence on the drug was dubbed the soldier's disease. Now, that last sentence is a bit contested, as I'm about to discuss further. Quoting now from an article titled The Army Disease, Drug Addiction in the Civil War by Jonathan Louis in War and History, which is a journal, in January of 2014. Although the hypodermic syringe had been available for a decade and its use was reported in medical journals, at first many American physicians were not familiar with Gross's suggestion and continued to dust wounds with morphine. As the war progressed and medical practices became more professional, the syringe gained popularity among some military surgeons. By the end of the war, the Union Army had issued 2,093 syringes to about 11,000 surgeons, though probably fewer actually used the instrument. After the war, many Yankee physicians recalled that syringes had been unavailable to them in the field, but contradicting evidence suggests that physicians often used syringes, especially toward the end of the war. So I want to pause here for a second to unpack some of that, because I don't think it's necessarily immediately obvious. So for one thing, there's a supply issue and a production issue. This is similar to what we talked about on our episode with the canned foods question. The U.S. government had to spend a lot of money getting factories up and running to be able to produce the necessary volumes of canned food for the soldiers to consume. So it would have been a similar proposition with regard to syringes. I think that these syringes were reusable rather than single use, and that would partly account for the matter of issuing 2,000 syringes to 11,000 surgeons. I don't think it was 2,000 syringes per per surgeon. I think it was a total use, and some surgeons obviously weren't using them at all. This shows that it was still a relatively small volume of production that was being deployed to this, but it, as we'll discuss in a moment, the Union side had much more access to a lot of this, both equipment and the drugs themselves. So I just wanted to emphasize there that there is a ramping up over time, right? It's not something that right at the beginning of the war there's this widespread use of syringes and morphine, but that's not to say there wasn't any use of it during the war, because it was certainly used more toward the end of the war, at least according to this. Now, continuing with this article. The Union, having access to world trade and poppies grown abroad, suffered from very little shortage in either opium or morphine. The Federal Army consumed approximately 10 million opium pills and over 80 tons of opium powder and tinctures. That's obviously much higher than the 500,000 mentioned in the 2002 source. After the Battle of Antietam, one Union field surgeon complained that the only medications in his possession were morphine and brandy. But in fact, that was exactly what medical books recommended that doctors carry with them in their pockets during engagements. The Confederacy, in comparison, attempted to grow poppy fields to supply its armies, but the crops proved inferior with very little morphine content. Consequently, the South relied on smugglers from the North and blockade runners to replenish medical stores. Yet morphine, despite its scarcity, was used in field medicine. In a letter to his wife, one Confederate doctor confided that the only way he could help wounded soldiers that came to his tent after the Second Battle of Manassas was to administer morphine. Continuing again with this article in another section. Since they were the most reliable drugs in their medicine cabinet, opium and morphine were used extensively by Civil War surgeons as pain relievers and I think this is interesting given the comparative level of casualties in the Crimean War and also to a smaller scale extent the Mexican-American War, these were also used for treating diarrhea because morphine, opiates in general, have a constipation effect, so this was a way of keeping people alive. I think it was also a reason that you end up seeing laudanum used with babies, not just to calm them down, but also to keep them from dying of things like diarrhea and cholera and dysentery. Continuing with this. Other uses for the drug ranged from the treatment of dysentery, stomach aches, gallstones, headaches, hemorrhoids, tetanus, typhus, syphilis, and neuralgia. Opium was usually administered in laudanum, the tincture of 10% opium and alcohol, and sometimes in pills. Morphine was mostly administered in powder form, but in some hospitals, injections were available. Because the needles were usually blunt, the surgeons had to puncture the skin with a lancet and then inject the drug. So a lot of dramatic information there, Rachel, but I'll hand it back to you to talk more about this.
Yeah, so post-Civil War, it's really hard to say, even for academic researchers, an exact number of veterans that left the war addicted to morphine, but the numbers were large enough to alarm public health officials and the federal government. I found a doctoral dissertation by Jonathan S. Jones called A Mind Prostrate, Opiate Addiction in the Civil War's Aftermath, and in that dissertation, he explores how the Civil War and the availability of morphine led to an epidemic of addiction. As one firsthand account from 1878 put it, quote, "The evil is like an epidemic. It is in the atmosphere," end quote. Further complicating efforts to help addicted veterans was the shame associated with addiction. So, quoting from an article about the dissertation, addiction was stigmatized and gendered, seen by many Americans as a vice afflicting the insane, the effeminate, and those lacking self-control. Opiate addiction therefore left addicted veterans emasculated and stripped of entitlements like pensions. And for these outcomes, veterans and their families blamed the medical profession. Veterans' opiate addiction, and in particular iatrogenic or physician-caused addiction, therefore threatened the credibility of the American medical profession, compelling physicians to embark on a constellation of progressive reforms intended to end the addiction crisis while bolstering regular medicine standing in the public eye.
I wanted to stop here for a moment just to note that, as we'll discuss with another source, and as I said earlier, this remains a very contentious subject because a whole bunch of those points that are made in that dissertation are basically disputed by other historians, right? And this is a long-standing thing now. It's been about half a century now of very heated debate back and forth as to whether or not these type of contentions were true. As we'll talk about later, the question of did people understand what addiction was at the time in a way that we would be able to recognize in order for them to stigmatize it in this way? Probably not. Not to say that there wasn't stigma, but they would have understood this phenomenon in a different way. At least that's the countervailing point of view on this. Similarly, there were talking points later established that claimed that people would try to hide this to protect their pension benefits, but there are other historians who say this was not a reason that pensions were taken away, so therefore that wouldn't have been a factor, and it would have been these broader social questions instead. So it's an interesting debate, but a lot of what Rachel just said regarding the fear that physicians had that they were going to get, and they obviously were in many cases, get the blame for driving this sort of dependency or prolific usage. Many of these physicians in the medical community start lobbying for various sort of harsh reforms to try to protect themselves and their industry. And that is something that then perhaps at various points in the discourse surrounding this, much later after the Civil War, influences how they are telling this story. And that that may warp some of our understanding of the level of dependency and usage after the war by these veterans. So it's really hard to pin down a lot of this, and we're trying to present sort of both viewpoints in this episode because it is kind of an unresolved debate.
Yeah, exactly. The historiographical discussions are still ongoing and definitely not settled. So I think there's some interesting viewpoints to be had depending on what primary sources are used or even found and discovered. I think there are a lot of primary sources that just haven't been discovered yet that may shed some better light beyond just accounts of doctors or veterans looking back from like a few decades post Civil War and talking about their experiences from that kind of like just looking back and writing their memoirs in a way that obviously kind of rewrites the history of it and kind of may be used to paint either the doctors themselves in like a better light or in a more like forgiving light than maybe was warranted at the time. But it's definitely not settled, the historiography of it. So going back to a blog post by Jones describing his doctoral dissertation, quote, by 1861, the beginning of the Civil War, American doctors employed opiates for approximately 140 unique medical conditions. During the addiction crisis, many doctors called for the profession to move away from the widespread prescribing of opiates, and this number plummeted. Other manuscripts, such as the William L. Dubois prescription records, indicate that the opiate prescription rate declined from an antebellum high of over 50% to a mere 16% by 1876, a decade after the opiate addiction epidemic began. These patterns suggest that at least some reforms proposed in medical journals to resolve the opiate addiction crisis were disseminated in practice to ordinary practitioners, confirming aspects of his preliminary dissertation research. And while physicians were trying to undo the damage they had caused by overprescription of opiates, there were still many veterans suffering from the effects. The stigma had serious repercussions for veterans who risked losing their military pensions, which required them to meet certain behavioral expectations. 19th century doctors also believed that addiction could cause insanity, so addicted veterans risked incarceration in mental asylums, where they languished for decades, as the laws of the day made it extremely difficult to leave. And I do want to point out here that at this time, there were physicians that saw addiction as a physical disease versus just a lack of morality, a lack of willpower. So there is kind of this sea change happening at this time versus just incarcerating addicts in mental asylums or sanatoriums. There was kind of a movement to open up basically addiction treatment centers or rehabilitation centers, as they would kind of be known in modern terms, that were trying to treat the addiction on that physical level without just kind of casting doubt on these addicts' morality or willpower. Also, there was a proliferation of patent medicine that were peddling cures to addiction. So patent medicine providers were not simply selling medicinal cures to addicted veterans. Instead, advertisements were also selling veterans a way to redeem their masculinity from opiate addiction. Patent medicine proprietors intentionally marketed their wares in the language of masculinity because they understood that addicted men, including veterans, were emasculated by opiate addiction. To Civil War-era Americans, opiate addiction signaled femininity, physical weakness, and most of all, unnatural dependence, all antithetical to Victorian manhood. Redeeming one's masculinity by ending a man's quote-unquote slavery to opiates, as doctors often described addiction, was thus a major selling point for patent opiate addiction cures. For example, Samuel B. Collins marketed his painless opium antidote using testimonials from veterans who supposedly cured their opiate addictions by way of Collins's wares. Byron McKean, a Confederate veteran from Galveston, Texas, testified in 1872 that Collins' painless opium antidote that, quote-unquote, now I feel myself no longer a slave but a free man.
Yikes.
So, yeah. So definitely there were still these kind of conflicting views of what caused addiction or what the effects of addiction were. So there were still definitely these kind of Victorian stereotypes of what a man was or what masculinity was. Um, so I think there were definitely people trying to humanize the addiction struggles, but there were also these stereotypes floating around, and these patent medicine proprietors would definitely use those tropes and stereotypes to sell their patent medicines.
Personally, I don't think Confederate veterans need to be weighing in on whether or not they feel like a slave.
Yeah, exactly. The slave terminology was used quite a bit. Addicts were seen as slaves to the substance, which was definitely very not great. And considering the Civil War era and why the war was fought. But that kind of language is definitely used quite a bit.
So I wanted to, again, circle back and bring up some of these counterpoints, or potential counterpoints, I should say, in the historiography, because this article that I've been quoting from before, The Army, Disease, Drug Addiction in the Civil War from 2014, sort of takes a contrarian view on a lot of the points that Rachel has been just covering from these other sources and historians that more lean in the direction that we've just heard. So some of the points that I wanted to summarize from the article, apart from what the aspects that I've already quoted, is essentially that contemporary accounts in the years following the American Civil War tended to only rarely mention the Civil War as a factor in growing opiate addiction, although it did come up, as in the examples we provided above, and certainly the patent medicine advertisements would indicate that there was some sort of a market for this. But the article in 2014 essentially argues that there was a much bigger push retrospectively to emphasize the Civil War a half century or so later. This would have come as part of the national push to start cracking down on dangerous drugs and drug pushers. It also would have happened at the same time as the national revisionism in the 1910s and 1920s about understanding what had happened in the Civil War and Reconstruction. And some public health advocates at the time also may have been searching for a category of addict that could be emphasized with public sympathy so that policy could be changed to help them. But essentially, some caution seems warranted in the overall question of the scale and war-related causes of addiction around the time of or shortly after the Civil War. Because you'll see, if you Google this or look on Wikipedia or whatever, you'll see all kinds of wild claims that are never really backed up by anything. I saw some History Channel article about this, and it just kind of threw out, like, there were 400,000 Civil War veterans addicted to morphine. And it's like, well, statistically, that doesn't quite sound right for a lot of reasons. But it also isn't really backed up by anything. It's just sort of an assertion that's made. And in many cases, these are based on reports that were made at least a half century, if not an entire century after the Civil War. So you have to be a little bit careful with that. And as we'll talk about, that number is definitely too high because we do have an approximate sense of like a baseline of how many people were addicted to opium or morphine in the late 19th century. And as Rachel is about to talk about, most of them were actually women. So we know that it can't be that there were 400,000 veterans that were addicted because the numbers just don't work out right if that was the case. But essentially, during or just after the Vietnam War, which would have been just over a century after the Civil War, historians began revisiting the matter and questioning whether the conventional wisdom that had developed long after the period itself had perhaps exaggerated the role of the Civil War in opiate addiction. But as we said, the historiography remains unsettled on that point. Some people in this sort of review period around the time of the Vietnam War came to the conclusion that, yes, in fact, the Civil War had created this morphine addiction wave among veterans, and some historians concluded the exact opposite, and that there was no evidence to support this. Some other points to consider here. Alcoholism in relation to traumatized war veterans of the Civil War obviously would have been a huge phenomenon too, but it probably would not have been as notable given the sort of general level of alcoholism in the U.S. in the late 19th century. We know that there was a significant problem with alcohol abuse in the 19th century, affecting very large swaths of the population, and to that extent, Civil War veterans affected by this would have probably kind of blended into the background on that point, and maybe that would have been less noticeable than opiate addiction, although, as we've talked about, a lot of the sources seem to emphasize that most Civil War veterans that were addicted tried to conceal that fact, or at least some of them did, although again, the patent medicine advertising would suggest that there was a fairly large known market out there at the time. And of course, there were plenty of other popular drugs in the late 19th century that didn't involve opiates, things like cocaine, to say nothing of other quack medicines. And we're definitely going to talk a little bit more about some of those patent medicines that were just, if they weren't alcohol, they were filled with opium or laudanum or something like that. Another fairly brutal consideration is simply that morphine was often used in the Civil War for the mortally wounded to make them more comfortable. These people would not have survived the war to become addicts later. That needs to be taken into consideration when we're talking about trying to estimate the numbers affected. And finally, and this is, I think, probably the most controversial point in this 2014 article, or at least controversial claim is perhaps a better way of putting it. This author contends essentially that addiction and chemical dependency and craving weren't really understood for most of the 19th century. And once they were starting to be vaguely identified in literature discussions among the medical communities, it still wasn't really very clearly stated or understood. So he argues that makes it hard to track and find the source of a phenomenon that people weren't really watching for at the time it was happening. Many of the late 19th century descriptions of people's relationship to opium, morphine, and laudanum use terminology that might, but also very much might not resemble the characteristics of addiction that we might recognize today, because there just wasn't a uniform vocabulary or definition for these things. And as Rachel said, words concerning issues of morality were more often mentioned. So kind of hard to gauge here what was going on, because some authors, as with that dissertation that Rachel was quoting from, are very comfortable backwardly applying our modern understanding of addiction to this situation at the time. And maybe that makes sense because you say, okay, well, it's the same chemicals, so it must have had the same effect. But on the other hand, it's harder to track it in primary sources and understand how people were viewing it or thinking about it at the time, because they were not using these modern concepts to think about this situation. So that's something to bear in mind as well. So the last sort of major thing that we need to talk about here is women and their relationship to opiates in the late 19th century, in the post-Civil War period, because a majority of the known addicts in the United States, at least according to surveys and other sort of contemporary research at the time, seem to have been women, rather than, say, all of these men that were coming home from the Civil War. And so the question is why? And it basically boils down to three areas, right? Legitimate treatments for medical needs and concerns, patent medicine frauds that we've been talking about throughout this episode that were often contained opiates in them, and then something somewhere in between, right? Something that is possibly a legitimate medical concern that needed some sort of a solution and is being treated in a way that we probably wouldn't do today. So Rachel, could you tell us a little bit more about the relationship that women had to opiates in the late 19th century United States?
Yeah, and this comes from an article called Women and Addiction in the United States, 1850 to 1920, by Stephen R. Kendall, MD. And this is an article abstracting material from his 1996 book on the same topic. Although epidemiological data are sparse, the mid to late 19th century apparently witnessed a rapid increase in the medicinal and recreational uses of opiates. During that same period, non-opiate drugs such as cocaine, chloral hydrate, chloroform, and cannabis came into vogue and were used in much the same way as opiates. In spite of increasing numbers of drug users during those years, quiet acceptance and tolerance of drug use was the order of the day. However, the changing social demographics of drug users, increasing knowledge about the dangerous effects of those drugs, regulation of the pharmaceutical industry, and emergence of the United States as a true international power during the latter part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century acted synergistically to change the country's attitude toward drug use from tacit acceptance to intolerance. This sea change in national attitude was legislatively formalized with passage of the Harrison Anti-Narcotic Act of 1914 and two 1919 Supreme Court decisions, Webb et al. v. U.S. and U.S. v. Doremus, which allowed the federal government to initiate a drug-fighting agenda characterized by strict national and international legislation and repression of both addicts and physicians. So it wasn't all men addicts either in the post-Civil War period. In fact, it was mostly women. Anecdotal reports of female opiate addiction were supported by the few available rudimentary epidemiological studies of drug use in the United States. Accurate statistics, however, were hampered because women often concealed their drug use from friends and family. Earl, writing in 1880, wrote that female opium eaters, or opium users, often indulged in the habit for years without imparting their secret to their nearest friends. Madison, writing in 1898, felt that women often concealed their opiate habits to protect themselves from unkind and unjust judgment. In part because of the temperance movement, some women used narcotics as a more acceptable alternative to alcohol because of its greater secrecy and less degrading effects. Despite many epidemiological limitations, Marshall found that women made up 56% of 630 opium users and 66% of the morphine users identified in his Michigan survey, and that women formed the majority of addicts in 88 of the 96 towns that reported addiction statistics. Earl, in 1880, found that 72% of the 235 opium users identified in Chicago were women. Hull, in 1885, estimated that 63% of opiate users in Iowa were women, and Nolan, in 1881, believed that 80% of opium users in Albany, New York were women. Assuming that between 150,000 and 200,000 opiate addicts lived in the United States in the late 19th century, and that between 2/3 and 3/4 of these addicts were women, probably more than 100,000 women used opiates chronically during that time. The most important reason for the increase in opiate consumption during the 19th century was the prescribing and dispensing of legal opiates by physicians and pharmacists. A limited therapeutic armamentarium available to medical personnel ensured that opiates would be used to treat an almost limitless list of ailments. Despite railing against the overprescription of medications by physicians, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in 1888 Despite railing against the overprescription of medications by physicians, Oliver Wendell Holmes specifically exempted opium, which the Creator himself seems to prescribe. Other physicians, however, were cautioning that physicians were prescribing opiates injudiciously, either inappropriately or for too long, or placing the remedies in the hands of patients who were willing to self-administer opiates without proper medical supervision. In this regard, Kane, a 19th century expert on addiction, indicted physicians who were culpably ignorant and certainly deserving of punishment, druggists, who in many cases sell the drug without a physician's prescription, and charlatans, utterly without conscience, who use deceitful advertising practices and lies to ensnare hapless victims. Even without the complicity of physicians, the general population had ready access to opiates in patent medicines and homeopathic compounds. An enormous industry supplying these products went unregulated until 1906 when the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, representing an initial attempt to curb the overuse of patent and proprietary medicines. The predominance of women in the addict population rests squarely with the use of opiate-containing medications of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So why were these women getting prescribed opiates? The most common use of opiates by women to treat organic complaints was for quote-unquote female problems. Marshall's 1878 survey revealed the most frequent cause of the opium habit in females is the taking of opiates to relieve painful menstruation and diseases of the female organs of generation. Madison remarked that among women, a large part of the deviations from health which induce the use of some form of opiate are dependent on disorders peculiar to their sex. Dr. T. Gaillard Thomas, president of the American Gynecological Society, wrote, "For the relief of pain, the treatment is all summed up in one word, and that is opium. This divine drug overshadows all other anodynes. You can easily educate her to become an opium eater, and nothing short of this should be aimed at by the medical attendant." So women were just getting massively overprescribed these opiates, and they were available readily, and not just from physicians, but also over the counter. And even if they weren't necessarily available over the counter, I feel like physicians were just really incentivized to prescribe these opiates just because they just didn't have much in their arsenal to fight against pain or other physical disorders. So the first thing you went to was opiates.
And it seems like there's a mix here, as we were discussing before we started recording, of legitimate medical problems that women had that needed attention and they weren't getting it other ways, or things that were, written off as hysteria or whatever, and they just wanted to calm the women down, right? So there's a mix of real and not real or misunderstood problems, and there's a mix of, well, we need to give them some pain relief versus just, here's some junk medicine. And it's kind of hard to sort out from our vantage point now of what was sort of legitimate doctor work and what was drug pushing, right?
Yeah. And I also found a Smithsonian Mag article that kind of adds to the counterpoint that it wasn't just Civil War physicians that were pushing these drugs. It was just pretty much physicians everywhere, prescribing them to everyone, not just veterans or people who suffered injuries due to the war, but just pretty much anyone could walk into a doctor's office. Or I guess it wasn't even a formalized office at the time. You would just go to the doctor's house, or he would come to your house and prescribe medicines to you. So it was just, I think, as we talked about in the discussion of the medical profession kind of becoming more formalized and professionalized, prior to that formalization, it was just very Wild West, basically. There wasn't a lot of like formal research. I think the research was just kind of coming out. There weren't a lot of the technological advances that we enjoy today. The germ theory had, I think, just barely been acknowledged as a proper theory. There was no AMA that would give like blanket policy advisement. So it was just very much, I think doctors were trying to do the best they could with very little information or tools in their arsenal. So the discovery of morphine was probably kind of a godsend for the doctors because they felt that there was a way to lessen the suffering of their patients, but they didn't quite realize the negative effects that would happen from prescribing these opiates to everyone. So from the Smithsonian article, doctors were really impressed by the speedy results they got, says David T. Courtwright, author of Dark Paradise, A History of Opiate Addiction in America. It's almost as if someone had handed them a magic wand. By 1895, morphine and opium powders, like OxyContin and other prescription opioids today, had led to an addiction epidemic that affected roughly 1 in 200 Americans. Before 1900, the typical opiate addict in America was an upper-class or middle-class white woman. And continuing, even if a disabled soldier survived the war without becoming addicted, there was a good chance he would later meet up with a hypodermic-wielding physician, Courtwright wrote. The hypodermic syringe, introduced to the United States in 1856 and widely used to deliver morphine by the 1870s, played an even greater role, argued Courtwright. Though it could cure little, it could relieve anything, he wrote. Doctors and patients alike were tempted to overuse. Opiates made up 15% of all prescriptions dispensed in Boston in 1888, according to a survey of the city's drugstores. Only around 1895, at the peak of the epidemic, did doctors begin to slow and reverse the overuse of opiates. Advances in medicine and public health played a role. Acceptance of the germ theory of disease, vaccines, x-rays, and the debut of new pain relievers, such as aspirin in 1899. Better sanitation meant fewer patients contracting dysentery or other gastrointestinal diseases, then turning to opiates for their constipating and pain-relieving effects. So I think, like we mentioned earlier, that kind of constipative effect was kind of something we don't really think about today as needing treatment via opiates. It's kind of using a nuclear warhead to treat like a fingernail. But they were turning to these opiates for those constipative effects just to make sure you didn't dehydrate and die from dysentery. So there weren't these classes of drugs that exist today that could provide relief without causing debilitating addictions. And it's interesting that aspirin didn't even come along until 1899. So you really had to bring out the big guns for pain relief, just because the less harmful pain relievers just didn't exist at that time.
Yeah, notable, I think, that you get Bayer producing both heroin and aspirin in the late 1890s within a couple of years of each other.
Exactly. And I think something else to talk about when we're talking about opiate addiction is that there were at this time, at the turn of the century, kind of the face of addiction changed. So like it said, before 1900, the typical addict was an upper class or middle class white woman, and then as the century kind of turned, then you saw like the opium den in Chinatown or whatever. It kind of became the face of addiction, and so it became much easier to kind of crack down on these medicines or the over-the-counter use of these medicines because addiction was seen as kind of a lower class, non-white affliction. So then it was much easier to crack down. So that's why in the 1910s, there you see like the criminalization of drugs at this time, whereas before it was just kind of available freely everywhere.
Right. And as we've talked about on previous episodes, linking together a whole bunch of trends of, quote unquote progressivism with a hygiene movement and a racial hygiene movement and a racial progressivism and eugenics, and you sort of swirl all those things together, and it comes out with this really toxic policy that a bunch of people convinced themselves was, the leading edge enlightened way of the future. Well, Rachel, this was a fascinating topic and one that I didn't really know much about, and I thought it was a good one to dive into a little bit because a few weeks ago we mentioned talking about 1971 and the 50th anniversary look back. We talked about the start of the war on drugs in the Nixon administration, and I thought it would be good to kind of go, as we often do, try to go back to the source and talk about in the second industrial revolution period of the United States, what was going on. So this would have been about 100 years before that. So, Rachel, thanks so much for coming on this week to talk about this issue with me.
It's always a pleasure.